Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. It's early 1942. In the months that follow the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the war in the Pacific is heating up. In Europe, Hitler and his generals are making plans for the massive offensive involving millions of men. In the Soviet Union, that will ultimately result by year's end in their Sixth Army being hopelessly surrounded at Stalingrad. Meanwhile, in Berkeley, California, another relentless assault is being prepared, one that will shape the course of a conflict that continues to our own day. This one will involve a marshalling and unleashing, not of tanks and troops, but of facts and ideas. And the battlegrounds will be neither Pacific Islands nor Russian steppes, but the pages of scholarly journals and books. If you've watched the last couple episodes, you might be guessing that the battle of ideas I'm talking about here is the controversy over what's become known as the Tübingen School or Tübingen interpretation of Plato. A battle, you might say, for the soul of Plato, as it concerns the ideas that are, or might be, at the very heart of his philosophy. It's this theory that the first principles of Plato's philosophy don't appear explicitly in his dialogues because he didn't actually want to share them outside the walls of his school, the academy. And you might remember that according to the Tübingen school, this core of Platonism was a kind of mathematical mysticism whereby the good, which, as we learned in the symposium, is the ultimate object of Eros, is identical with the one, which is the absolute unity of being. In our last episode, we took a quick look at some of the things that Tübingen scholars and their followers have cited as evidence for this theory. But if you joined us 2 episodes ago, you'll know the Tübingen thesis touched off a strong counter-reaction, with both sides eventually using unusually nasty language to try to undermine the other's positions and even to throw shade on them personally. I'd like to start looking at the arguments marshaled against this controversial theory, because last time we looked at those in favor. But first, I think it would be good to do a certain kind of archaeology to dig a little bit into the background of this conflict and some of its key people. It's possible you might be feeling a bit confused about something I've said. You might remember that the Tübingen interpretation was basically launched in 1959 with the publication of Hans Joachim Kramer's Virtue in Plato and Aristotle on the nature and history of Platonic ontology. And yet I've just suggested that the battle for the soul of Plato began during the Second World War. I think both are actually true. That's because, as strange as this may sound, a work of critical importance to the opponents of the Tübingen school was actually written in the 1940s. And the reason for this is something I touched on last episode. Because scholars had long been familiar with the main pieces of evidence, especially the things Aristotle wrote about Plato having this unwritten teaching and about the principles of his philosophy being the one, which was a kind of principle of order, and the indefinite dyad, which was a kind of mathematical chaos. Because they were already familiar with these things, the idea that Plato had an unpublished teaching that the good was one had been put forth for a long time. The Tübingen position didn't just come out of nowhere. It was really just an attempt to try to compile the evidence systematically and try to work out in unprecedented depth how Plato's dialogues can be better understood in the light of the unwritten doctrine that they tried to reconstitute. But just as the Tübingen interpretation gave rise to a counter-reaction, so did these earlier, less elaborately worked out versions of the theory. And one scholar stands out for attacking these earlier versions with particular relentlessness. I'm talking about the great American scholar of ancient philosophy, Howard Chernus. I mentioned 2 episodes ago another great American philosophy professor, Gregory Vlastos, who wrote that scathing review of Kramer's book in the early 60s. But Vlastos was actually drawing heavily on the work of Chernus, under whom he actually studied, and other critics drew heavily on both, so that the criticism of the Tübingen interpretation actually owes a lot to Chernus, who, therefore, in a way wrote the classic refutation of Platonic esotericism more than 2 decades before the Tübingen position actually appeared in print. This refutation was contained in a series of 3 lectures Chernus gave at Berkeley in April 1942. The lectures were published together as The Riddle of the Early Academy in 1944, the riddle being basically the question of why Aristotle attributed to Plato the views that he did, that didn't actually appear in Plato's dialogues. It's a short but very impressive work, consisting of, as I suggested earlier, relentless attacks on the idea that Plato had this arcane teaching about the One, eloquently written and founded on a dazzling knowledge, not just of the writings of Plato, but also of the teachings of his successors at the Academy, and importantly, of Aristotle also. Chernus had studied at Berkeley in the 1920s, where he made friends with, among others, atomic bomb scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had also actually been a childhood friend, it seems, of Chernus's wife. You may be familiar, actually, with that line from the Bhagavad Gita that Oppenheimer claimed to have quoted after the first atomic bomb test. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It seems possible he discovered this text actually as a result of his friendship with Chernus, because Chernus had studied Sanskrit at Berkeley, and Oppenheimer himself studied it for a time after Chernus introduced him to his Sanskrit professor. Anyway, Chernus then studied under Paul Shorey at the University of Chicago. You might remember the brilliant scholar with anti-German tendencies from a few episodes ago. Like Shorey, Chernus went on to study ancient philosophy in Germany, an experience, it seems, that wasn't an entirely pleasant one. He was there in 1927 and 1928, studying under a professor by the name of Ulrich von Wilamowitz Müllendorf. According to the memoirs of another American professor who knew Chernus, Chernus said, quote, that Wilamowitz would pepper his lectures with remarks about the political situation in Germany, and that his students would applaud by loudly stamping their feet on the floor. The remarks were of such a nature that they caused Chernus to develop an intense dislike for the man. I don't recall how he characterized the remarks, but Solmsen's description, and Friedrich Solmsen is a German-American classical scholar. Solmsen's description of the anti-democratic, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and Chernus was Jewish, his description of the anti-democratic, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic Prussian lens through which Wilamowitz viewed Weimar Germany, which was a progressive culture, would explain Chernus's antipathy. So it's interesting how the Academy has changed since then. We typically associate it with views to the left of center, but there was a time when nationalism was the dominant force in universities, or at least some of them. Anyway, I should mention I'm particularly indebted in this episode, and for example, the fraternities in Europe were sort of quasi-military organizations, or there was an element of the military there. I should mention I'm particularly indebted in this episode to Wikipedia, or nationalistic anyway, to Wikipedia, whose source of information on these scholars clearly documented, which is good, often with materials that are also available online, so you can just investigate. Anyway, soon after giving those 1942 lectures against Platonic esotericism, Chernus volunteered for US Army service, and according to an obituary of him in the New York Times, became a captain in a British intelligence unit within 3 years. It seems that he continued to work in this capacity for a time after the war ended, hunting down Nazi collaborators in Europe. And there's a story from a American paratrooper who, it seems, was captured behind enemy lines, who at some point met a French resistance leader. And she talked about having met Chernus, who asked her about this young French man, who it seems, even though he was working for the Americans in Nuremberg at the time, was actually a Nazi collaborator. And he was, the young Frenchman was soon thereafter executed, I think, by the French. But anyway, it's interesting because the paratrooper who wrote these memoirs mentions Harold Chernus by name, but doesn't, which I guess is understandable, doesn't seem to be aware that he had this entire. He mentions him only as a military officer. He doesn't seem to be aware that he had this whole other life as a great scholar of ancient philosophy. Anyway, Chernus returned to Berkeley after the war, but switched to Princeton after the University of California announced it would require its employees to sign an anti-communist oath. Hard to imagine today, of course, but these were the McCarthy years. Chernus's old friend Oppenheimer had become director of Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study in 1947, and Chernus was the first faculty member he appointed. Chernus remained with the Institute until his death in 1987. Loyalty to Oppenheimer and resistance to McCarthyism would prove to be a bit of a theme in Chernus's life. In opposing campus McCarthyism, Chernus actually found allies in German scholars who had fled the Third Reich and to whom ideological loyalty oaths had a disturbingly familiar ring. An anti-oath public letter organized by Chernus would be signed by, among others, Oppenheimer, plus many German-American scholars, including Albert Einstein. Chernus, with others, also fought successfully to keep Oppenheimer employed at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study after Oppenheimer started to be widely suspected of being a communist spy and lost his security clearance. It was at the Institute for Advanced Study that Gregory Vlastos studied under Chernus after completing a PhD in philosophy at Harvard under Alfred North Whitehead. And Whitehead is the English philosopher and mathematician he'd also taught Bertrand Russell. And Whitehead is famous for once referring, you might have heard this quote, referring to the whole of Western philosophy as a series of footnotes to Plato. Vlastos himself was actually born in Istanbul in 1907 to a Scottish mother and a Greek father. And according to a biographical note on him on the Princeton website, when his family heard of his intentions to study in the United States, they warned him that if he went, he would lose his soul. He actually didn't begin his career as a philosopher. He started his studies at the Chicago Theological Seminary and soon thereafter became an ordained congregational minister. He received his doctorate from Harvard in 1931 with a dissertation entitled God as a Metaphysical Concept. He taught for 17 years in Canada at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, before moving to Cornell in 1948, more or less across the lake, at around the time Chernus returned to Berkeley after the war. Like Chernus, Vlastos ended up at Princeton, where he taught and studied for more than 2 decades, from 1955 to 1976. And it was there, of course, that he studied under Chernus. By the way, you might remember the writer and philosopher Rebecca Goldstein, author of the 2015 book Plato at the Googleplex. I've mentioned her in her book before, which, by the way, spends very little time on the Tübingen theory. Unless I'm mistaken, and my apologies to the author if I am, I believe it's relegated to a footnote or two. Anyway, Goldstein, who is also Jewish, her father was lucky to get out of Poland alive before the German invasion, but some of her cousins were killed by the Nazis. She came to Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study also and studied under Vlastos. So there's that sequence that I mentioned the other day that goes all the way back to Paul Shorey. In a 2019 interview, she spoke about the pleasures of reading Plato closely under such a gifted scholar. And she said, I took a seminar on Plato with Gregory Vlastos. It was my first in-depth exposure to Plato, and to have it come to me by way of this first-rate Plato scholar was a privilege. I found Plato an absolute trip, and I loved the artistry of the dialogues, the theater of them. That seminar with Gregory Vlastos was a great help when, decades later, I wrote Plato at the Googleplex. Actually, Goldstein, though, was on the whole disappointed with life at Princeton. In that interview, she refers to reading Plato under Vlastos as the, quote, silver lining of that time. She encountered sexism. She graduated in 1977. But still more troublingly, a competitiveness, she said, that seemed to her to stifle the love of learning. She said in that interview, more unnerving for me was the sense of being incessantly ranked. With every comment you uttered, you had the feeling that you were being assessed as to whether you were a good or a bad philosopher. So often I would hear a grad student ask about someone else, is he good? Followed by a decisive answer. I'd think, how do people even know such a fact so decisively? What's the tell? The question of who was good and who wasn't, of whether I was good or wasn't, these weren't the kinds of questions I had come to graduate school to think about. But the atmosphere was such that those questions did come to take up mental space. I found that nothing more effectively drains the joy out of thinking. Anyway, for their part, the Tübingen scholars were of a younger generation than Chernus and Vlastos. They would have been too young to serve during the Second World War. But it's hard to imagine, of course, the war not shaping them in some way. And actually, not only Hans Kramer, but one of his two collaborators in advancing the esotericist reading of Plato, Konrad Geisser, had studied in the 1950s under Wolfgang Schadewald, a highly renowned classical scholar who became friends with Martin Heidegger at the University of Freiburg during Heidegger's infamous period of Nazi Party membership. But I think it would actually be hard to connect Schadewald himself with the Nazi Party. He was actually a member of the Wednesday Society, which was a group of German academics with ties to the anti-Hitler resistance movement. And after the 1944 attempt on Hitler's life, the Gestapo swept in and shut the club down and arrested many of its members and actually executed some of them. So there are a lot of interesting personal connections behind this debate, and I haven't been able to resist, obviously, the temptation of devoting an entire episode to them. I'd actually be remiss if I didn't include one last anecdote, this one about one important adherent of the Tübingen interpretation, the Italian scholar Giovanni Reale, whose 1984 book on Plato I mentioned 2 episodes ago. and who seems to have experienced something of a road to Damascus conversion to it. According, at least, to Tübingen scholar Konrad Geiser, Reale had initially intended to write a book critical of Kramer's work, critical of Kramer's book, until he, in Geiser's words, quote, made the small mistake of reading the book closely, unquote, which its opponents had not done, according to Geiser, and thereafter began arguing enthusiastically in support of it. Okay, well, I do have to stop at a certain point and move on, stop all this academic gossip, and move on to what these critics of the Tübingen school actually say. And that's what I'll be doing next time. Until then, be well, and thanks for watching.